Good morning, I'm Pastor Dustin Abbott from Emmanuel Lighthouse United Pentecostal Church here in sunny Petawawa, Ontario, Canada. And I'm here for your weekly devotion. I want to talk to you about one particular story from the Gospels I think that illustrates a broader point about Jesus and an example that he set that I believe that we should follow. And so we're going to find our story in the book of Mark chapter 1 and beginning at verse 41. It says, "Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, 'I am willing, be cleansed.' As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed." Now, of the various Gospels that cover an account like this or similar ones, it is Mark that uniquely uses the word about how that Jesus was moved with compassion. And this word that is translated compassion is only used in the Gospels and only used of Jesus. And it speaks of a factor of motivation that was in Jesus' life that I believe was absent from so many others. So lepers, as you probably know, were considered to be probably at the lowest of the low as far as disease went in ancient Israel. Leprosy was an utterly destructive disease that not only would eventually result in death, but would result in disfigurement and isolation and basically being kind of driven from normal society. And so much so that as kind of a modern part of our vernacular, when you talk about treating someone like a leper, it means to make them essentially untouchable, to have nothing to do with them. And in fact, we find that lepers ended up being outside of the typical circle of Jewish religious life, in part because someone like a rabbi or a Levite, a religious leader, they typically would avoid lepers altogether because they didn't want to even come in close enough contact to where they might become ceremonially undefiled. And so because they didn't want to lose out on something by coming in contact with a leper, they would just avoid them altogether, which means that not only were lepers kind of ostracized from a lot of day-to-day activities in their society, they also were largely ostracized from having a normal kind of religious life, of being ministered to. This particular leper, in coming in contact with Jesus, he says that if you are willing, you can make me clean. And so it was a statement of profound faith in Jesus' ability to do it. But there is also that recognition in the leper's life that this was maybe in his mind an extraordinary request, a big ask, as we would call it today. He was asking Jesus to do something that was outside the confines of normalcy in their society, and for him to come in contact with him. And so in this case, the Bible says that when he asked him and says, "If you're willing, I know you can do this," Jesus' response was, "I am willing." And there was this kind of very definite and sure article. And then what is beautiful about this, the Bible says that Jesus was moved with compassion. And the Bible says before he said, "I am willing," the Bible says he stretched out his hand and he touched him. Now understand that by the ceremonial law of the day, Jesus in doing that was making himself ritually unclean, which means that there was some purification process that he would have to go through himself. And it was that, even if it was minor, but that inconvenience that kept so many religious leaders from having anything to do with lepers. But Jesus, in this moment, he's not thinking about the inconvenience to himself. He's not thinking about, if I come in contact with this, I'm going to be unclean till evening. I'm going to have to go through some kind of purification process. No, he's not thinking about the cost to himself, but rather he is moved with compassion. He is moved beyond thinking about himself and how this affects him and the inconvenience to himself, but instead, he has moved himself into the space mentally of this leper, and he is more concerned with the plight of this leper, the hurt and the pain and the isolation that he is enduring. And so Jesus reaches out to touch him. It's that first touch of reassurance saying, "Hey, you're not in this alone. I do care about you. I am concerned with your plight." And then there is the verbal recognition, "I am willing," and the command, "Be cleansed." And the Bible says when the word is spoken, immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleaned. So I think that there are some beautiful things here that we need to grasp onto. And one of the first is that one of our theme this year is about build the church. And it's around the idea of making disciples, that people make up the church. We're in the midst, yes, of a building project and building a new facility that, Lord willing, in a few months down the road, we will be occupying. And I'm very excited about that. But the real church is not that new facility that we're building. The real church is the people that will occupy it. And so if we are going to make disciples, there has to be this moment where we start to consider with compassion the needs of other people and move those needs up on our priority list ahead of our own inconveniences. You see, making a disciple is almost always an inconvenience. It's an investment of time. It's an investment of treasure. It means that you're going to have to think less of yourself and more of another person. And it is that very cost that in many ways keeps a lot of people from really being disciple makers. They come in, they sit on a pew, they enjoy services, they go through the routine, but they leave church and they are not moved to reach out, moved by compassion to reach out to touch the needs of others. And certainly not those that might be considered undesirables. See, that's the thing, that very often you're not going to find disciples amongst those that are already sanctified and ready to go, those that are ready-made Christians in our minds. But often the cost of making a disciple is reaching out to someone who's messed up, maybe a bit of a misfit in society, someone whose life is broken, not maybe by leprosy, but they are a social leper because of their addiction and their bondage, or maybe failures in their life. They've never made much of themselves, but they're a hungry soul and they are looking desperately for answers. And what they need is people who are willing to be moved with compassion and to reach out to touch those who are untouchable, to reach out to show compassion to those who many consider to be unlovable and undesirable. And in that pattern of Jesus, we show why he was something of a completely different breed than the religious leaders of the culture that he came to. Those religious leaders were too caught up with themselves, too caught up with their own holiness, too caught up with their own religious identity. But Jesus was moved with compassion. He reached out and touched those who had need. So I want to challenge us, each one of us, including myself, to try to follow the pattern of Jesus, to recognize that making disciples requires some sacrifice on our part and a willingness to get out of our own heads, out of our own space, and to reach into the need of someone else's life and to touch them with love, with compassion, and with the saving power of the gospel. I pray that this gives you food for thought this day, and I challenge you to have a time of prayer after this, asking that that spirit of compassion that Jesus had would be transferred to you, and that you would have a love for the lost, a love for the hurting, a love for the lepers, like Jesus did.